Hi everyone, you're listening to Conversations with Loulou. I'm Loulou Khazen, an entrepreneur living in Dubai, an investor, a mother, and your host. Before we start, a quick note to thank our sponsor, Joy Gifts, a gifting marketplace operating in 22 cities across MENA like Dubai, Riyadh, Jeddah, Beirut, Cairo, and more. You can download their app or visit their website, joygifts.com, and order anything from flowers, sweets, balloons, and you can get a 15% off on everything by using the promo code LOULOU15. That's LOU15. So thanks, Joy Gifts, for your support. My guest today is a friend, is someone that I've known for nearly a decade, Christopher Schroeder, or Chris Schroeder. He's the co-founder and CEO of Next Billion Ventures. He's an active angel investor and advisor to tech startups with a keen interest on emerging markets. He sits on the investment committee of Wamda Capital and Saudi Telecom Ventures. Most recently, he became a network partner for Village Global, which is an early venture capital firm backed by the likes of Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, Diane Green, Sarah Blakely, Jeff Bezos, Reid Hoffman, and many, many more successful entrepreneurs. He sits on numerous private company and nonprofit boards. And that's not even 10% of everything he's done. He's had a role in politics, having worked with the George W. Bush Sr. presidential campaign. Then in 2000, he became the CEO of the Washington Post Newsweek, the WashingtonPost.com and Newsweek.com, where he spent the next 4 years leading the business. And in 2013, he published the first book on Middle East and North Africa's entrepreneurship scene called Startup Rising: The Entrepreneurial Revolution, Remaking the Middle East, with a foreword by Mark Andreessen, and I really love the book. Today, Chris speaks extensively on global innovation for the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, TechCrunch, among others, and he's seen on CNN, CNBC, BBC. He was also named one of LinkedIn's top 50, first 50 influencers. He's an active member of the Young Presidents Organization, or the YPO, and works on connecting US entrepreneurs with Middle East CEOs and entrepreneurs. So Chris, welcome.
I'm so happy to be with you, Loulou. Thank you for having me.
There was much more, but like I would have been reading for like a good 7 minutes if I had to read it all.
Apparently I can't keep a job, I think.
Well, I'm super honored to have you here with me. I've known you, I think, for nearly a decade, as I said, and it's been such a great pleasure. You're one of the most helpful people, and really that I've met. You're super keen on entrepreneurship, and we're definitely going to cover a lot of this today. But I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about your background, because you come from a very accomplished family, let's put it this way, and your parents were both lawyers, if I've done my research correctly, and they've also worked. They had some philanthropic projects where they work with university students by giving them access to music. So what I wanted to ask you is why music? Why was music so important to them?
You know, I think if there was a white noise or a soundtrack to my growing up, it was music, with a particular emphasis on classical music. They are Italian, children of Italian immigrants, and I think that was very much embedded in them, and they always did that. My mom is really quite extraordinary. So she went to college when she was 14. She went to law school when she was 18, and was, I think, one of 2 women in her law school class in the late 50s, and then went to work in a law firm in New York City. And so always had a very deep passion about, accomplishment, never felt inhibited about any kinds of issues about being a woman in her time and all. In fact, one day I asked her, it's amazing you did what you did when you did it as a woman. And she looked at me kind of funny and she said, my parents never talked about me being a woman. They just couldn't believe that an Italian got a job on a big Wall Street law firm. And that was her nature. But one of her first clients was a woman who built what was one of the great music centers in New York called Caramore. And so she began literally as her estate lawyer as a very young woman, and then over the years eventually got involved in the organization with his passion of music. My father, again, also came really from very little, just was raised with music. He loved music. He was a fanatic about it. He was a great pianist. And then about, over 10 years ago, he made a determination to marry his passion about educating young people with one of the things that very often young people don't have access to, which is music and musical instruments. And the research is very clear about how young kids perform if they have access to music and arts in their lives, and how they perform in school and how they perform on exams and all. So he built an amazing thing, which called ETM, and it has been a real impactful thing in the New York City area to help kids get access to instruments and teaching at times when many of these programs are canceling them.
That's fantastic. So your mother didn't really know a glass ceiling per se.
I think she probably knew it was there, but she broke it and just kept coming, which had an amazing influence on all of us.
So were there a certain set of values that they've passed on to you, and now you're a father of 3, that you were passing on to your children, apart from the fact that you're all Harvard grads in the family?
Well, not all, but look, I think they taught us, first and foremost, I think they were very much educators by nature, and they valued education a great deal, and conversations at home were always sort of Socratic, if not outright Italian-American debates. And, you needed to be prepared. You needed to back up what you had to say with things that are important. They combined that with a complete straight as an arrow sense of integrity and character. And they backed it with a very deep conviction that you should do what you can to help people around you and any opportunity that you can to do it overall. And they not only talked about it all the time, but they really, I think, kind of lived it, which of course is the greatest example that a parent can give to a child, because kids know when parents are bullshitting them. So at the end of the day, you walk the, like, it's like running a company, like you walk the talk or you don't, and anybody around you can tell the difference.
That's very true. And you what's the set of values that you've passed on to your children?
I think there are a couple of things that are very similar in that. Certainly, we've exposed them to the world and have made them unapologetic global citizens, and they've traveled a great deal and think about stuff. But I think one additional element of valuing that sense of service and integrity is to really throw gasoline on what you love. And there are many things I'm sure I've screwed up as a father, but one of the things I did when they were little was I kind of watched where they gravitated naturally, and then we would throw gasoline on it and sort of really support it, with a caveat being is that you have to have some stick-to-itness. And this is important. So if a kid wanted to try a musical instrument, that's great, but they couldn't drop it a week later. They had to kind of get through at least a semester of it and kind of get through a sense of commitment. And so it's been a balance of sort of saying, you have to go for what you want to go for, but at the same time, you got to stick to it because, as a great entrepreneur, this is true in life, generally speaking. It's the stuff we don't want to do that tells us a lot about who we are, because you have to do things you don't want to do, and you have to stick through to things when they're not necessarily that easy. And it's not easy to instill that, but I think it was something that we certainly focused on. Yeah,
100%. I was interviewed recently, and I spoke about passion. A lot of people say you have to follow your passion, and I said it's really the grind that takes you through difficult phases, and not really the initial stages of passion, but it's the daily work. It's the getting up every day and doing the same thing over and over, and hopefully being able to deliver great results. So definitely I agree with you on that. You have to stick to it at least for a while, and then figure out if it's something for you or it's not. 100%. So talking about your career, I mean, obviously you have a fascinating background. You've started your career in politics, then you were a CEO of 2 corporates, and then you moved into entrepreneurship, and you started Health Central, which is a tech startup focused around health. So was there a trigger there? What made you switch from like a nice CEO job to the hustle?
I think at the very least, I was very much entrepreneurial throughout. I mean, when I was a kid, I had my own DJ business in high school and college. Like
You
I always
did?
was, yeah. I was,
Wow. Okay. I
but
didn't
by
know
the way,
that.
being a DJ in those days is not what you think a DJ is today. Like this is doing
Okay.
like weddings and family events. Like it was nowhere near as sexy as you're lighting up as it to be. But I loved music and I like to do it. But more importantly, I like trying different things. And frankly, that job ended up being a catastrophe. The business blew up, which was a very good, humbling experience early on. But I think I always had an inclination for wanting to go my own way and kind of figure out things that I love and try to make them happen. But I was more of an entrepreneur in the corporate setting. So when I ran the digital businesses at the Washington Post and Newsweek, it was this completely separate company. It reported separately to the board of directors. And there's a lot of, co-work and co-authorship with a traditional business, but we were also kind of unleashed to try to take this thing into a new area. But in that experience, I realized I didn't want to do just co-authorship. I actually had it in my teeth to solve a problem. And that's when we formed Health Central with some investors in the United States. The essence of it was, at the end of the day, came from personal experience, which is often the case in entrepreneurship, right? I'd gone through a period where my mother-in-law lost a terrible battle to cancer, and one of my closest friends lost a very long and terrible battle, very brave battle, to depression, bipolar disorder. And in both these instances, I had no idea really what was going on. I had a thesis about what I could do to be most helpful. And you have a little bit of sense of my nature. I wanted to get in there and solve them and help them and whatever I could. But I found they were very hard to find. I found these communities of people going through exactly what I was going through. So literally, I found a community of family members of someone having the exact same cancer my mother-in-law did. I found several communities of people who had friends who had bipolar. And I learned from these human beings that I knew nothing about. We had no connection other than this, that pretty much everything I was doing to be helpful was kind of wrong. And it was a humbling experience
How
of,
so?
again, the whole nature of, I want to take charge and I'm going to find a solution. I mean, families often don't want that, at least not at first. You have to kind of lean back and they take the lead and you have to help them, where you're asked to be helped and how you navigate that. Look, I'm a grandson of Italian Americans, bipolar disorder, depression. I'd kind of never heard of it. It was sort of something that you just sort of get
Quite
over.
taboo also. Yeah.
Yeah, there was certainly kind of a stigma. I mean, when my friend first told me about it, I'm like, what's wrong with you? Like I couldn't quite process it. But through my journey with him and through these groups that I found, it was a complete journey of a revolution of the power of individuals to take control of their lives, to do the best they possibly can with it. And it was a trigger for me because it was hard to find these communities. And I and the team that we put together said, what if we could make this easy? What if we could build a platform of people just like you who've been through a tough health situation or a very exciting wellness kind of a circumstance, and you could connect them to share those experiences. And sometimes those experiences were clinical and medical, but 70% of the time it was how do you live your life on a day-to-day basis. And that was the essence of Health Central.
So you connected people around the health issue.
Yeah, on their terms at great levels of specificity. So it wasn't merely the ability to have a platform to say, have women who have breast cancer. It was, I'm a 28-year-old mother with 2 children and a well-meaning pain in the ass husband with breast cancer. And I want to meet people who are in my dynamic, who can share my real life circumstances. So it became a very good series of granular experiences that we thought was very impactful.
But was it like a switch? I mean, I know a lot of people, actually the majority of people are in the corporate world. They all have their jobs and their careers and so on. So like, how did you make that switch? Was it, I mean, yes, I understand the situation, but like, how did you actually do it? Did you just one day say, okay, I'm going to resign, or did you start working on Health Central in the parallel, or how did you do it?
I had mentored a lot of different entrepreneurs and, was very deeply kind of involved in the broader, more tech media space writ large. So I had it in my teeth to do something. In fact, before I ended up running WashingtonPost.com, I was even tempted to do what a lot of people were doing at that time and go to Silicon Valley. But the job was so interesting and I thought it was a great consumer brand with amazing problems. I thought I could really learn a lot, and build something pretty significant that could take me into a lot of different directions. But having said that, you're pulling on a string, which was a real weak moment for me. And it's something that I'm cautious about when I meet entrepreneurs now, which is intrapreneurs, women and men who are very successful in navigating kind of innovative areas within big companies do not often make very good entrepreneurs. Because when you're an entrepreneur, no matter how tenacious you are, no matter how much you want to look at the world in a different way, in the background, you've got a balance sheet behind you, you have a brand behind you, people still answer your phone calls, your parents are proud of you. Like you have that, and it's a mindset.
Your parents are proud of you.
Oh, it's true, because they can tell you who you work, who you work for, and all of a sudden you're in Health Central, and your parents, who the fuck are you? Like it's like a weird kind of a dynamic. And remember, my parents were extremely supportive of pretty much everything that we did, but they were lawyers by training. And so it's a different mindset, that you have happen. And so what I would tell you, Loulou, was my first year at Health Central was one of my weakest as an executive, because I had to adjust. I had to pull out some of my natural entrepreneurial stuff back. I had to reaccustom myself to doing a lot more hands dirty things to get it done, and to spend much more time working with and building and cultivating a team and building a culture. And it came around in my case. And I have found sometimes that some entrepreneurs are fantastic entrepreneurs, but more often than not, it doesn't work very well. And so you have to really look in the mirror and ask yourself and really understand as best you can what you're getting into. But as you know from your own experience, you never really know what you're getting into until you're actually doing it.
You never. That's 100%. But so you talk about your first year. Sorry, I want to question you here, because I think it's very interesting. Did you feel that, were you overconfident about your abilities, like most people usually in the corporate world are? Because sometimes, when I talk to people who are considering starting businesses, they would be like, I'll just build a website and I'll do this, and it's super simple, and then when they get to do it, then they see that no, it's actually not that easy. So is it overconfidence, or is it just the fact that you don't have that backbone behind you anymore, and all of a sudden you're
a little bit, in my case, a little bit more of the latter. I mean, you obviously have to have a element of confidence to just say, I'm going to build something that wasn't there before, to break out. And then we convinced some very good investors, Polaris Venture Capital and Sequoia and Allen and Company, some very kind of established people went for the journey with us quite early on. But you learn very, very quickly that things that you took for granted and assumptions you make, are not necessarily at the same level or standard of what your customers are expecting, or what even, your experienced investors do. I can remember the very first cut of designs we did of some of the sites that we were creating. I shared with one of the top guys at Sequoia, and he said, I see what you're trying to do here. I think there's a lot of potential, but I would never go to this site. I'm like, what do you mean? And we had a long conversation about it. And he got me thinking about a bunch of questions that I didn't have to think so much about, because millions of people went to WashingtonPost.com. Like, they went because underlying it was a news product that they wanted. I now had to really convince people from the very moment they came onto our experience that they were like, oh my God, thank God this is here. And it just, we did it. We ended up making something which was something he went to regularly. But it was this kind of moment of kind of transition that, was humbling, but it was good. It was very good.
To agree with your friend Reid Hoffman, his definition of entrepreneurship, where you run off a cliff and you jump off a cliff and you build a plane, and then you on the way down, and then you go back up.
All the time. And I mean, it is not, you've experienced this, Loulou, and the many things that you have done yourself. It is not a linear experience. I mean, in hindsight, it's a linear experience. Like, we all want to say our lives are up and to the right and look back on it and say it was always like this. And obviously, in some instances, people have done that. Most entrepreneurial experiences are more like sine waves. Like, you have this up, you feel like you nail it, and all of a sudden you're looking yourself in the mirror saying, I can't believe I'm going to have to fire a bunch of people. And then you start rethinking about it, and all of a sudden things start to go, and then a trajectory moves. But you have to steel yourself for it, because again, there's nothing to fall back on. That's why Reid's analogy is so good. You are falling. Like, there's no brand that's going to keep you from falling. So you have to just keep hustling.
That's very true. So I was going to ask you, I mean, were there certain things that you learned in the corporate world that you took with you, certain characteristics or certain skills that maybe transcended your different careers, like something that kind of stuck?
There were a bunch of things from my past that were extremely helpful in the way that I thought about doing an entrepreneurial venture of my own. And this was a huge advantage to me when I was fundraising in in subsequent rounds and that kind of stuff. I had spent, before I'd worked briefly in government service, I actually worked in investment banking. So I had a very good understanding of how CFOs thought. I had a very good sense of how financing worked. I had a very good sense of, what were the stipulations of it. And I had a whole bunch of relationships that I could lean on to help me think through different things in a tutorial, right? I mean, Brad Feld's book hadn't come out yet. Scott Cooper's book had not come out yet. There was not a lot of pattern recognition on it. And I was able to have that kind of resource. And I could also speak the language. So when I talked finance and investment aspects, I had that sort of facility with it. Being in a corporate world, and certainly being in an entrepreneurial venture, you learn about how much time you have to spend building culture. You learn a great deal about how much time you really have to think about what people around you are thinking. And I learned this a great deal in my entrepreneurial experience, and it's just been beaten into me in every experience subsequently, which is when you're the CEO or the founder, you have a lot of context of what's going on that nobody around you understands at all. And you can't explain all of it, and some of it is too early to explain, or some of it you don't even know fully yourself. But often you'll communicate to people as if they know what you know. And people never know what you know. And at the end of the day, most people are getting up in the morning, going to bed at night, really thinking fundamentally is whatever you're talking about, Schroeder, what does it mean to me? And if you don't keep it kind of simple and tight, and if you don't understand that people aren't on the same journey that you are, and if you don't listen carefully and make the exchange very well, you can't really get them on board. And it's always a combination of startup. Between one level, you want everyone's feedback, but at one level, you got to move. And you have a better odds of moving if people, in fact, understand what it is and where you're going.
Absolutely. That's usually one of my recommendations to entrepreneur, is that you have to try to pitch it to your mom or your dad or your grandmother who know nothing about your field, and try to see if they can understand at least the basics of what you are trying to do. Communication is key, by the way. Storytelling, I believe, like your ability to tell a story and communicate properly is extremely important as an entrepreneur. It can't be understated.
The caution you have to have is that you can get tied to the story, and you can get your culture tied to a story. And sometimes the data starts to question your story. I can remember a couple of moments when we would pivot into other activities or other products. People around me would say, well, wait a minute, I thought we were doing X. And then we'd have to sit and analyze, like, well, we were doing X, but the market, there wasn't the product market fit the way that we thought we are. We're seeing some real evidence that people are loving this. We're going to throw more gasoline on that, but it's jarring. And so you have to be tied enough to the narrative that people have a sense of your mission and your North Star, but you have to also be able to build in your culture the sense of flexibility that based on information, you're there for your customer and you're going to help figure out that solution.
Do you believe, based on what you've just said, do you believe entrepreneurs make better investors?
Look, I think there are different ways to think about it, and I'll talk out of two sides out of my mouth, right? At one level, I can make an argument that entrepreneurs are great entrepreneurs and investors are great investors. And I think this is very often the truth. The skill base, the musculature, the broad-based pattern recognition that you have as an investor, having seen many things like it, sometimes can be an encumbrance to you, but more often than not, you just have much more to be able to lean in thinking about how to assess a company and what companies have been successful and which have not, which is not necessarily the skill base of an entrepreneur who's gotten up in the morning, gone to bed at night, doing what she's doing and kind of thinking about what she's thinking about overall. So there is that trade-off. But overall, and I think this is a very powerful thing, which has been, I hope, beneficial to me, but beneficial in other investors that I admire, is that if you've been in the shoes of that woman, like, you just have a different conversation with them. You know what they're thinking. You know what they're saying. You have a sense of the pressures that they are under. You know that some finance person has bullshit them sometime in the past. You know that they're a little bit reserved about stuff. You want to make the environment safe so that they'll never surprise you, that they'll tell you what they're going through so you can help them solve their solutions and really build that connective tissue. And I have found that entrepreneurs know other entrepreneurs, and they know great investments that are in potential that are out there, and that they can speak a language once they're investing in an engagement, which is very powerful. And so I think some of the best venture capital operations that I see are kind of a mix, where they've got folks that have been there before, but also have done a lot of investing. And they may have people around there who have not necessarily done it as much, but they really have a very good instinct about how to invest and how to structure a deal that's efficacious.
Interesting. Well, I'd like to thank you, by the way, for giving an example in the she, because usually in our part of the world, an entrepreneur or a business person is always a he. So it's very nice to actually hear.
Can I tell you a funny story about that? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
So I wrote this book. It's many years old now, though it got updated, but it's still pretty dated, about startups in the Middle East. And one of the things I really wrestled is, should I write a chapter about women in the ecosystem, because it's a big issue globally and it has certain dynamics of it in the Middle East. And it was very funny. I interviewed like 50 women, a lot of different women. You were in the book.
I was one of them. Yeah.
You were one of them. But you're an interesting example for what I'm about to say, because some of the women that I talked to were like, yeah, of course I'll talk to you. Look, there is something distinct about being a woman in the Middle East, and I want to be able to put that out there and put it out there. Then there were other women, of which you were one, are like, look, I know what you're going to do, because this is what gringos do, right? You're going to write a chapter about women in the Middle East, and you're putting in there, I am not a woman entrepreneur. I am an entrepreneur. If you want to talk about my company, I'll talk about my company, and you put me somewhere else in the book. But if you're going to label me, I don't want it. And it's very.
It's not about labeling, by the way. I stick to that, but I would still not want to be labeled a woman entrepreneur. But I'm saying even when you're giving an example, when the context is business, it's a he. When the context is family, it's a she. So there's the stereotype all the time. So it's nice.
Well, we got to break that.
Exactly, big time.
Yeah.
There's one thing I've noticed about you. I think you know everybody. You're everywhere. You're traveling constantly. You're into so many industries and boards, and so you're like a power networker. Do you have any tips for like entrepreneurs that want to be like you? Because I mean, in a way, I'm sure that's helped you a lot throughout your life. That's opened up opportunities. That's probably helped you fundraise, helped you launch your next billion ventures, helped you work with the Global Village, for example. I mean, these are great organizations. So, do you have any tips?
Well, I mean, there's a cautionary observation, and then there's a tip, I suppose. And the cautionary observation is I think people over network. And I think when people,
really?
And it goes to my tip. Yes, because I think at the end of the day, and I see this all the time, you've seen this in the Middle East, like all the time.
You're talking about entrepreneurs now when you say people.
It could be anybody. I think at the end of the day, let's take entrepreneurs as an example, because you and I would probably come up with a similar list of women and men who are this way. They show up at all the events. You see them all the time. They're on the covers of magazines. They do all this kind of stuff. But it's hard to know what they actually do. Like they're so focused on the networking. They're not focused on getting up in the morning, going to bed at night, with steel in their teeth to build product to get into the market. And they win awards and they aggregate a bunch of little pieces of money. And they're there and they're lovely people. But they're more interested on being on the cover of a fashion magazine than they are in actually doing the hands dirty work. And so I think you can lose yourself and sometimes convince yourself that being out and about is good for building. And it can be, as I'll come to in a second, but it's a cautionary note about where are the lines of it. And that's where the tip comes in, which is I've never thought of myself as quote unquote a networker. What I am is two things, and have always been. I'm unbelievably curious. There are things I'm trying to understand, I'm trying to piece together, and I know that more often than not, I just don't know anything. And so I like to be with people who understand these things, and hopefully my pattern recognition is of value to them, but it's just an opportunity to get to understand them and whatever, which it leads to the second element of it, which is I almost never ask anybody for anything. I mean, I ask customers for things. When I'm selling my product, I pitch money, I ask for money. But I'm not at this to build some kind of name brand thing. I, in fact, never talk about the people that I know explicitly ever. I mean, at the end of the day, I feel that we should be of service. And every good entrepreneur, if she or he is honest to you, they will tell you that their success was built on a network of people who bet on them, almost always never asking for anything. And I have found that in my life that I've been able to have these amazing, walks into communities because I'm genuinely curious. And they know that in a heartbeat, I'll do anything I can to be supportive to them. At the end of almost every meeting I ever have with anyone, my last question is invariably, what can I do for you? And over time,
very true.
You build trust. And that's what you've built. And it's not a network like, you do this for me. It's not transactional, though there are sometimes benefits to transaction in them. It's really a long game of established relationship.
So I suppose, I mean, of course, sometimes you have to ask, right? If you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a business, as you said, you have to raise money, you have to hire people, you have to ask for recommendations potentially. So yes, you may have to ask, but I think what I take from what you said is it's a long-term game. So potentially you could start building those networks early. then maybe when there is an ask eventually, then you can ask without, obviously, the ask being the first thing you do when you meet somebody. And I've seen it happen because I attended those networking events, and sometimes I've seen entrepreneurs sort of like over pitch investors or be very aggressive in approaching someone and starting to pitch immediately. I mean, I don't know if it's the right way to do it. It's certainly not my way to do it, because I find it, I don't know, very intrusive when you even if you're in a networking event and that's what you're supposed to do. But I find it a bit intrusive when someone just walks in on you and starts pitching you.
Look, let me drive the point home this way, because when you are at a network event, and they are not without value, I expect, like, there's a context to it. I expect that people are going to come up to me and tell me a story, and I would like to do that too. More often than not, I'd like it to come from someone someone that I know, like there's some frame of reference. But I don't begrudge someone whose their job for being there is a fine investor pitch, and we can begin that journey. But I think what people underestimate is that over the long term, the greatest challenge an entrepreneur has, an investor has, a friend has, is to find well-vetted quality human beings. And when I'm in a position that I've gotten to know you, I have an opportunity to do a favor to somebody else by the act of telling them you should meet Loulou, right? It's a favor to someone, not a distraction, not an ask, to be able to say that this opportunity, this entrepreneur, this human being is really special. Like, you can trust them, they have integrity, they will walk through walls, they will never let you down. The deal may or not be something that you want to do, but this is someone I've known for a long time. I'm not really as much doing you a favor, I'm doing them a favor, because the hardest thing for us to find are people that we can trust. Absolutely. And outstanding talent. And so it really is a long relationship credibility building, because the old cliche is true. Credibility takes a long time to build, and you can wipe it out in one really bad moment.
Absolutely. So just I wanted to wrap up the sort of the part about you a little bit, or the getting to know you. You've obviously written the book, Startup Rising, and it's your first book, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And it's about the Middle East and North Africa region. Why?
So my journey there was in some respects accidental, and in another level not. I mean, as I described before, I've been a globalist. I'd been to the Middle East as a tourist and loved it, was intrigued by its history. When most Americans ask me, why are you interested in the Middle East? Honestly, my first reaction is, why aren't you? It's been one of the most foundational relationships, engagement in America, often with very complicated and very not good outcomes. And I think it's almost a responsibility to try to understand it more. But the epiphany came with your and my mutual friend, Fadi Gondor, and some other people some years ago, who began to talk very early about a very different narrative about the Middle East than anything that you hear about on CNN, even to this day, right? CNN and most of the news in America is about doom and destruction almost anywhere, but to the degree they talk about the Middle East at all, that's what they talk about. And here is Fadi and people like that saying, you can't believe what this new generation is unleashing. Like, it's unbelievable. And look, I'd outsourced technology to many places in the world. I've been to many places in the world. I knew talent was everywhere. I even knew some entrepreneurial activities were happening in places which were profoundly entrepreneurial anyway, but I mean in a tech sense. And I got invited in 2010 for the first major gathering of startups in the Middle East that Fadi was one of the hosts of. And within 2 hours of being there, I knew my life had changed entirely, because it was 3,500 young people who really didn't give a damn about any political circumstance. They were getting up in the morning, going to bed at night with a problem in their teeth they wanted to solve. They were often self-taught and very sophisticated about technology. There was another 3,500 young people on a waiting list trying to get in. The conversations I had, the mentoring sessions I had were phenomenal. I was so impressed by it that I went to Cairo and Amman on the same trip and saw more of it on the ground. And I came back from that trip and I wrote an op-ed about what I saw that the Washington Post published. And often when people publish your stuff, then other people think you actually know what you're talking about, which was, of course, absurd at the time. But I realized that I needed to understand that there was something very powerful and very hopeful coming, not only in the Middle East, but if it was happening there, as of course it was happening anywhere where people had access to technology. And that the journey was, people ask me all the time, what's the most exciting tech out there? And I can talk about AI and genomics in very interesting ways. But for me, the question of our era is not the tech itself, but the universal access to it, and how this is evolving society, how this is changing opportunity for business investment, and how we can do problem solving bottom up in a way that you and I couldn't talk about really well even a decade ago. And so that's that. At that point, I was in. I wanted to understand the Middle East, and subsequent to that, I've been now spending time in Asia, Latin America, a little bit of East Africa, and the stories are all the same. It's a very hopeful thing in a time where I think it's very hard for many of us focused on the general news to feel very hopeful right now.
Do you feel that entrepreneurship, I mean, given also your political background, do you feel that entrepreneurship can solve political problems?
I don't know. I don't know, Loulou, you and I have had this conversation in a lot of different formats, right? Because at one level, entrepreneurship is a bottom-up phenomenon, right? I believe this quite firmly. I think the best thing government regulation can do mostly for entrepreneurship is kind of to step back or to open up free reign of individuals to actualize and build success. And I believe they have a vested interest in it. I mean, when we see companies that are allowing 70% of communities that are not having access to financial inclusion, people don't have good access to education, and there's no way on earth governments are going to be able to fund the schools at a caliber that are required for the 21st century, and young people bottom up are going at that, like, we should be cheering them on. But the reality is twofold. One is top-down matters. This is not just a bottom-up thing. The environment, the regulatory environment, the ability to move ideas, goods, talent, is phenomenal, and that is run very much by government. And, government tends to move not quickly. And so there is this kind of back and forth where I think lots of folks are trying to understand it and trying to make good for it, but it comes from a very different place and a very different perspective. I think, Dubai has been, relative to many other places, a very good model of trying to encourage this kind of development. I think Singapore has been this way. I think Estonia has been this way. Often it's kind of smaller, countries that are really looking to leap from themselves. But then every so often there are these hopeful examples. So, I think they're very interesting debates, including the entrepreneurial and the investment ecosystem in Indonesia and Brazil, to think about fintech regulation on its own terms. But we'll have to see if that really happens. We'll have to see whether the pressures of established enterprises push back on that. And so I think that the biggest benefit that entrepreneurs do is not, quote unquote, making government better, though again in Estonia and Dubai and places like that, clearly there are government 3.0 things which are very impressive, and I think America can take a lot from those playbooks. But I think the very act of success breeding success and entrepreneurs showing what kind of impact they can build in society, that in and of itself is one of the first great things that can be done to get at least the willing governments to be more embracing of it.
So speaking of entrepreneurship and young people, so if you were asked to give, let's say, a commencement speech to, let's say, students at the AUB, I mean, do you still sit on the board?
My term ended there, but yeah, I was on the board of the AUB.
You were on the board. So if you were asked to give a commencement speech for students, what would you say today? In June 2020. So what would you tell them today?
What I would say today is more important and emphatic today, but it's been true, I think, forever, which is that we have to really check our narrative bias. The story is a little bit, I was alluding to this before. We all have stories in our head. We have stories about ourselves. We have stories about each other. Right now, you have a story about Chris Schroeder. I have a story about Loulou. People who are listening to us have a narrative. And stories are really important, as you pointed out earlier, right? They help you have a cohesion in what you want to do. They're a communication to get things into action. But we can start getting into self-confirming areas that become very problematic. And we don't want to ask questions that challenge the very premises of the things that we believe. And in the era that we're in right now, social media has compounded this, right? I mean, invariably, we are following on Twitter and Instagram. People kind of think the way that we do. We're not necessarily open to hearing pushback and other data that conflicts the kinds of things that might make us walk in someone else's shoes in a very powerful way. It is ironic that in the first time in history, essentially all of human knowledge is at our fingertips, essentially for free, and that same technology allows us to lock down in our narratives. And this is not just like you'd say in America, an old media, Fox, MSNBC thing. This is a day-to-day unwillingness of us to reach out and try to understand the other side of an issue in a substantive kind of a way. We move on to the next hashtag. We're busy in our lives. It's easier to ratify around a story that we have in our minds. And we're seeing now, I think, across the world, really multiple problems of this. Look, I believe that Facebook and a lot of these big social media platforms, like every great innovative organization, should be rethinking things that they do. They should be asking about things that have happened unintended or intended, that they can make things better. I don't have any problem about that. I think there's fair criticism of Facebook and other places that need to be absorbed. But I think the essence of fake news is us. I don't think we take anywhere enough individual responsibility for our willingness to say, if we see something, if it doesn't quite feel right, or even if it does feel right, is there another view that we can seek out? Can we aggregate our truths more? It takes a little bit more work, but not a lot. It takes much more consciousness, but not a lot. And I think at the end of the day, it's much easier for us to organize around what we already believe. And there is a multiplier price being paid for that today from any time in history, but it is something which I think has always been true.
I love this. I love this, to check your own bias and reach out and listen to the other side. Absolutely important today, especially since what we see, I mean, you know, the technology has accelerated. I agree with you that it's also the individual's responsibility, but the amount of news that's just being shared en masse is just incredible. Great advice. And so I'm going to take you back 10 years, and I found a 2010 interview with Harvard Business Review where you were speaking about creativity, and you talked about entrepreneurship as a form of creativity. And back in that interview, you said that the 21st century is the century where tech is essentially empowering people because it helps us find information. I mean, you just said it, all the information is at our fingertips. It helps us communicate more, and it helps us build experiences. So you gave an example about YouTube as a platform that helps people unleash their creativity. So is it still relevant in 2020? I mean, 10 years later?
I think that not only is it more relevant than ever, because 10 years ago, we would fantasize about the Middle East having 2/3 of the population with smart devices. And obviously in the Gulf, we've gone way past that. And even across the Middle East, we're in that area, and that's true around the world. 10 years ago, we knew that a younger population was coming of age and was dominating 30, 40, 50% of a different country. That now generation is of age, who's never known a world without technology overall. But I think the real compounding and acceleration event that is taking this to a new level is what we're going through right now with COVID. Because we've seen, in my view, a shift of virtualness and acceptance of virtualness from my mother to my child on believing this stuff actually works and can be embedded in our lives to a point that we actually want to rethink our lives. So how we travel will become different because people are now comfortable with the interactions that are happening and like what we're doing right now. The act that I can now talk to a doctor in my bedroom, and I could always do it, but now I'm comfortable doing it and she's comfortable doing it with me, gives me a better sense of empowerment. I feel stronger and more comfortable in my bedroom than I do in a place that I can't control overall. The fact that I can supplement my education well beyond anything that's available to me, you know, I think these are just profound shifts. The idea that Saudi Arabia and other countries have effectively said, because you can get infected with cash, you all now need to find a mobile solution to money. Like, you don't go back. Once all of a sudden the world goes from, yeah, some places like China use mobile money, but other places it's still kind of gradual, to all of a sudden moving. Like this is like a cliche, but it's true. 5 to 10 years of behavior shifted back into this multiplier effect of what I described 10 years ago, with a huge, huge demand. And the demand is this. Everything I've just said, I believe, is true. What is also true is, you pick the number, you probably have better research than I do, 2 billion people on the planet still don't have basic access to technology at all. So what I have just said is compounded something that we've all put a lot of lip service to, but now we have to look at serious as a heart attack. We've all talked about digital divide for a decade or more, that there are people who are not getting access to the technology that you and I take for granted. But 2 billion people in a world of accelerated engagement into virtualness aren't having access to technology. That's like saying, yeah, you can go to work, and yes, you can have a job, but you're not allowed to get on a road. Like that's what we're effectively saying to mass amounts of our populations today, that we now have to address in a very different way. Because for those with access, things have gotten accelerated. For those who don't, there's a very deep risk that not only will they be left behind, but what an opportunity to help people become healthier, to become part of the economic system, to actualize their own visions, what they've had before. So yes, it should be a wake-up call as well.
I have three comments on what you said. The first one about the numbers, by the way, I recently interviewed Rayan Karaki. He works at Google here, and he told us that 200 million people in the Arab world don't have access to internet.
Staggering.
So going back to your point, yeah. The other thing that you mentioned about accelerating digitization of everything, in another talk that you did, you talked about healthcare specifically, and you gave an example about a nurse that when you were at the hospital, a nurse came to you and felt by touching your hand that there was something wrong, something that all the machines and the reports could not detect. So how do you replace that, let's say, in the digital world?
Look, it is. I talked a little bit about that in that TED talk. It is, in one respects, one of the great questions and callings of our time, which is, what does it mean to be human? What is it that we do, that we want us to do in ways that the algorithms may at some point be able to do, but do we want them to be doing that? And by the way, it's going to be a pretty long haul for them to get to some of what we're talking about. So the story that you're talking about was that I was in a hospital for a very simple procedure. It was not a big deal in any way, but for reasons that they cannot fathom, I got a pneumonia in the lungs, an infection at the hospital kicked into my lungs while I was there. So literally, I'm coming out of stuff, things feel pretty good, and I'm thinking, oh, okay. And then all of a sudden, people start to panic, and they take care of me and do something called code blue, which meant they thought I was going to die, and then they fixed it. But the person who caught the problem was the nurse. It's exactly what you described. So there are two doctors around me looking at all my charts and all the mechanics, and everything was going fine. And a nurse kept holding my hand and patting my leg and saying, you don't feel right to me. Feel. And the doctor's like, what are you talking about? Look at all the numbers. The numbers are fine. She said, I know, but look at them. I look at them. I'm feeling his skin. Like, something's not right here. And they're like, no, don't worry about it. One of the doctors even left. And literally at that moment, all my vitals and machines just dropped like in half. And she called it. She got people in motion because of that. Because there is something in human interaction. I think we've learned this big time also for all the power of Zoom, which I think is powerful. We have realized that this conversation we're having is special, but nowhere near as special, Loulou, if you and I were in a restaurant somewhere, or we're going for a hike somewhere and talking about it. And there is something in human connective tissue which I don't think will change. I think that AI and technology will take risk away from some of our jobs. I think they'll take some mundaneness out of our job. I think we can think more excitingly about what kind of work people can do anywhere in the world. We shouldn't assume that everything people are doing now is the best that we can do. But at the same time, I think the gating question is, what is it we can do? What can be unleashed in partnership with the technology that's coming? So that element of what is unique about us as human beings will be manifest. And I think some of the more interesting entrepreneurs out there are thinking about that balance, particularly coming out of what we're coming out of today.
Great. I was going to ask you, I mean, what are you, when you're looking at investing these days, you are investing actively. So what do you look for? I mean, are there specific sectors?
Yeah, as a word of hope to folks in these kind of funny times right now. In the last 3 weeks, I've signed 2 term sheets, and an amazing company that I and Reed, in fact, are invested in, just got a very good A round closed. And so, like, we're still moving. Like, it's going to be hard for a while.
Where is the company based?
The company that we just got the A round on, it was a New York-based company, but it is helping with the remit. It's called Tap Tap Send. It's these are great entrepreneurs, and it's helping getting remittances from Europe primarily to Africa, but it will expand really well beyond that. And just a tremendous amount of learning in COVID. It's been, this is just as a quick digression. It's so fascinating. Like, the last couple of months have been the best months in the company's history. And part of the reason for that is it's all been about mobile money and mobile remittances. And what you learn in this is that when everyone locks down in COVID, their traditional ways of going to a bank or Western Union, they cannot do. So they needed to find a solution to move money back home, and they found us. And so it was so interesting and almost counterintuitive. At a time like this, you would think the business would not do well, but in fact, it's doing very well because we have a unique service at a time when people need it in a very unique way. And so that kind of stuff I think is very powerful overall. But look, I mean, I think this is a cliche, but it's unbelievably true. And you have lived this, right? It all begins with the woman or man building the company. It all begins there. In fact, I have to tell you, when I get pitched, and I get pitched literally every morning, I'm on Zoom till 3 in the afternoon receiving pitches, and 80% of the time I never get to the deck at all. Like, I want to talk to you. I want to know why you want to solve this problem. I want to know why you think it's important. I want you to know how big you think it really can become. There are many other things you can be doing with your life right now. Why are you doing this? And I asked some interesting gating questions, which really get a sense of, how committed you are and how serious that you were thinking about this. I'll ask you, like, what are you going to do if this fails? And the answers are fascinating. There's a spectrum. One end of the spectrum is, it'll never fail, I'll make it work. And that's okay, but maybe it means you're closed-minded. Other people will say, you can slow me down, but you can't stop me. And so I will listen to the data and I'll listen to the audience. I know I'm on a good problem, and if I can solve the problem better and differently, I'll get a good answer. And other people say, I'll go back to McKinsey, which is also a fine answer, but it's a spectrum of answers that tell me about you as the individual. And so that to me is where it begins. Having said that, sectors and countries matter a lot to us overall. And since right now my primary focus is in rising markets with MBV and some other vehicles that I'm in, there are very key sectors which are benefiting by this acceleration that I'm talking about. So I think payments and fintech, and particularly lending, SME lending, is something which is being unleashed to literally millions and millions of people who've never been able to get it before, because historically they haven't been able to be credit scored, and or banks just don't think they're worth their time. But now you can actually build all sorts of data about people's behaviors and predict who is likely to pay back and start building a track record there, which can be very powerful, both at the consumer level and the B2B. I believe that in most rising markets, the way trucking is done and shipping is still unbelievably antiquated. And so there are several companies, including one in Egypt we invested in, which is effectively kind of an Uber for trucks, but it's taking a highly fragmented industry, putting it on a clean, transparent platform, and allowing your goods to be tracked, allowing trucks to go in and out more filled so the small business owners can be more successful. And this is going to be really, I think, very, very powerful overall. And look, consuming is about to come back, and marketplaces are really interesting to me. We've had some experience in property tech, which I still think will remain interesting, but I still think there are a lot of interesting dynamics of how people are engaging. Now, I have to tell you that I've been very skeptical about healthcare and education, not as a thing, but as an investment. They tend to be very long slog. They take a lot of capital. Often you have to navigate regulatory and established legacy issues, which are hard. But I'm going to start looking at these spaces again a little bit post-COVID, because I actually think there are going to be behavioral things unleashed that might actually become more interesting and beneficial. And I think there's going to be some interesting conversations about how we value education. I mean, 4-year education is what it is. But in point of fact, employers just want people who can actually do what it is that they need to have done. And there have been many solutions in process, but more than I'm seeing now that I'll take a look at again in a way that I kind of ignored them previously.
Great. Education is definitely, I mean, higher education is changing for sure. But I believe COVID now is accelerating the changes on the schooling. And it would be
There's so
interesting
many
to see
ways
what's
to
going to
learn
come
right
out
now.
of it.
You know, I mean, you described me as kind of a Harvard family, and there's some truth to it, but my eldest son is like on his 5th gap year from a great tech school called Case Western in the United States. And he has been working actually in the Middle East with venture capital funds and startup stuff, and he's been traveling the world. And I don't know if college is the right thing for him. I think he's learning, he's learned so much more by doing and by using technology than 90% of the college grads that I meet. And so life is going to change. I mean, you know, your parents still want you to go to X university, and there's still plenty of benefit to them. But I had this amazing...
people that can't afford this kind of education.
They can't afford it, but they also are asking bigger and different questions. So I gave a talk to a bunch of young leaders in Europe last summer, okay? It was about, I don't know, 200, 175 young leaders that were picked from around them, which means by definition, they probably went to one of the top schools there. And we were having this kind of conversation, and I asked at one point for a show of hands, how many of them think their kids will go to a 4-year college? And like 8 hands went up. And this is the new, these are like 23-year-olds who've just come out of one of those things, who are saying there's just so much coming and so many ways to learn that it's going to be a revolution. My issue as an investor has been, how long will it take? And how much money and capital does it take to get there? But I think, again, I don't know if what's just happened will change it that dramatically, but I think we can ask really, really exciting new questions about it now.
I think the price tag of higher education is simply prohibitive for a lot of people. You know, I mean, if you want to go through 4 years of college in the US, you're talking probably $250,000. That's
least.
a lot of, I mean, you can start a business with that. You know, there's like a million things you can do. So,
Right.
And you can learn online. There's like a million courses out there. So I don't know. I have big questions about the traditional way of learning. So we've covered a lot of things. There's a lot more I'd like to ask you about, but I'm conscious of your time. And maybe if I were to ask you to describe entrepreneurship in one word, what would you say?
Tenacity.
Tenacity. Okay. And if
it really is. You know, look, Loulou, you've lived this, right?
Yeah,
I mean, you're
absolutely.
one of the great mentors and great experienced people in here like this. It's when everyone around you is saying no that you just keep coming. And you go through these sine waves and you just keep coming. At some point, you make a determination. If it's not going to work, it's not going to work. But you go down swinging. And yeah, I think that is the word.
Agree. I'm fully with you on this. And are there any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave us with? Is there something that's inspiring you these days? Something maybe has changed that you think we should know about?
I think it's not so much that something has changed, because I think, you know, you have lived this, and I think the people that are close to you and listen to you are of this ilk. But I will say, what might sound obvious, but I think it's important to underscore, which is it is time for us to step up. Like if this last year has taught us anything, and all of us have hopefully been trying to step up, and we've been embedded in our lives that we want to step up in some form, we are at a historic moment of opportunity of actually having not only a desire to do something, but an ability to make things happen that we sometimes feel we're in the face of things that are too big for us to be able to do it, where in fact the opposite is the case. And I'll give you an example. So, and it really hit me, I think, quite significantly. The amount of initiatives here in America and elsewhere to be helpful in COVID, it could be a neighbor helping a neighbor, but it could be people trying to get masks to hospitals, or all that's been unbelievable. But the multiplier things that could be launched when people think globally about this are very powerful. So a few weeks ago, a few young entrepreneurs that I've gotten to know in Estonia had this kind of fledgling B2B platform that allows you to exchange ideas for corporations. And they were talking to the government of Estonia and said, you know, this platform could really be used, and you could use Slack and other things. And we could have a hackathon to help on COVID in Estonia, and let's do this. And so the government supported it, they did it, got it up and running in like 48 hours, typical venture capital thing. And within a week, they had 1,800 participants, 40 ideas that were actually being put in implementation that ranged from cheaper ventilators to just kind of platforms of information that people could use. All very good. Well, the internet being the internet, other people heard about it and started banging their platform. And like within a week, 100,000 people around the world in like 40 different countries were using this platform to do the same in their area, always focus on what they could implement from doing what they're doing. So they decided from there they were going to have a global gathering. And by the time they were done with all these different efforts, something like 250,000 people around the world and 90 different countries, creating literally hundreds of now inimplementable funding ideas to help make the world better around COVID was done. This outpouring of desire to make impact, to take the idea I have and to make it something, is unleashable in a way that is exponential from even the time when you and I met. And so I think this is just an incredible time for all the fear that we see in the news to say, now we can step up and do something about it. And that excites me no end.
Maybe ask the question, how can I be of service, which is something that you said that you always ask people, and see what difference you can make.
We are of service, whether we're creating the global hack or whether we're doing something else. So yes, we have ambition. Yes, there's things that we want for ourselves and our family, but you know, why are we here?
Great thought. Thank you so much, Chris. It was truly enjoyable as usual. I love our conversations. So thank you for allowing me to ask the questions this time.
Well, thanks for engaging. It was great.
Look forward to talking again. Thanks a
Thanks.
lot. Okay.